As I think many of you know, Mark Lilla is a professor of humanities at Columbia University. He's the author of many books about politics and philosophy. In fact, he was just here a year ago at Politics and Prose for his last book. He also writes essays that appear regularly in the New York Review of Books and other publications, and his new book is called The Once and Future Liberal. Now, The Once and Future Liberal is only 141 pages long, but do not be fooled. It may be a slender volume, but it's already incited heated conversation, perhaps maybe even a little anger in a few quarters, and that's thanks to the opinions contained in it. The subject, of course, could not be more topical and more worthy of rigorous debate. Since the election of Donald Trump last November, Democrats, progressives, and liberals have been grasping for ideas about how to regain their political footing, how to construct an effective message, a winning electoral strategy, and a credible vision of how to get our country where it needs to go. Yet, month after month, maybe hour after hour, amid the torrent of presidential tweets and outrages emanating from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the Democratic Party still seems adrift, or at the very least divided. No coherent or compelling message has emerged, and no single political figure or leader has yet inspired a broad swath of America with a credible, let alone inspiring answer to Trump and an alternative, effective path forward. Mark Lilla has paused for a moment amid the cacophony and chaos of the Trump era to offer his own polemic, his own diagnosis and prescription for liberals. Although he teaches intellectual history, this book is not really, strictly speaking, a work of academic scholarship. It's more a political argument, an admonition to liberals and progressives and Democrats, of which he says he is one, that continued reliance on identity politics will further erode the political and electoral power that the left so desperately needs. Of course, it's already happening, as measured by diminishing numbers of Democratic office holders at all levels of government. The root cause is, in part, he says, purity tests, a rigid adherence to identity politics that undermine broad-based coalition building and prevent Democrats and progressives from truly understanding and connecting with groups beyond coastal elites and minorities. Now, if polemics are meant to inspire debate, Mark has wildly succeeded with this book, and we look forward to a lively conversation here at Politics and Prose this afternoon. Although he's been on the end of some tough interviews and criticism since the book came out a few weeks ago, he's sticking to his guns, and we applaud him for his willingness to put himself out there to discuss and debate the critical path forward for tens of millions of Americans who remain in despair after last November's election. In conversation with Mark today will be Sean Iling. Sean has taught philosophy and political science at Loyola and Louisiana State Universities. He's been a staff writer covering politics at Salon. He also served as a paramedic in the United States Air Force, and he currently is the interviews reporter at Vox. Please join me in welcoming Mark Lilla and Sean Iling to Politics and Prose.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and a rather robust crowd, as expected. When Mark told me he was going to write this book about maybe 6, 7, 8 months ago, I told him that he was going to be under fire from all sides, and surely enough, the slings and arrows have been incoming from all sides. And this is a conversation about identity politics, which is all the rage right now. That is a very difficult conversation to have. I think Mark's book is an important contribution to that discourse. And I think maybe the best way to sort of jump into this is your book is as much a work of diagnostics as it is anything else. Right? You're laying out what you identify as a problem. And I think the best way to sort of lunge into this is to maybe have you describe, you see modern American politics as sort of divided into two periods, or dispensations, as you call them. One is the period between Roosevelt and Reagan, and basically ever since Reagan, right, post-1980. So maybe you could just kick us off by explaining what those two periods are, what defined them, and maybe more importantly, what went wrong for the left.
Okay. Thanks. I didn't know you had been a medic. I'm going to need one on this book tour. So I think I'll pack my own when I travel.
My certificate is expired.
Well, a way of getting into an answer, I think, is for me to explain a little bit the passion with which I went into this. And, you know, at the most proximate level, it's that Donald Trump was elected president, and understanding what that meant. I spent a lot of my time studying the right, writing about reactionaries, and I could tell what was coming. But more deeply, what was behind it, I think, is a kind of biographical tale, and that is that I grew up in a place called Macomb County, Michigan, and if there are real political junkies in the room, they know exactly what that means. Macomb County abuts Detroit. It's a blue-collar suburb where Eminem grew up, and 8 Mile Road is the border between what used to be an all-white county, now no longer is, and Detroit. And I grew up on 12 Mile Road. So I grew up very close. And in the early 60s, when I was young, Macomb County was the most liberal suburban county in America. It gave the highest suburban county votes for Kennedy and Johnson. By 1972, George Wallace won the primary, and Nixon took the election, and the county that was voted Democratic on certain governors and certain presidents essentially checked out of the Democratic Party, and people like Stanley Greenberg have written books about it and kind of follow what's going on. So I saw this happen in my life. I saw this happen in my family. I saw this happen with my neighbors. And my family, it was just as stereotypical Democratic blue-collar family that you can imagine. You know, one of my grandfathers was a farmer. The other one was a cop in Detroit. My paternal grandmother kept a picture of FDR by the side door. And every Palm Sunday, she would bring back a palm from church and stick it behind the picture, and it would get all dusty and ugly all year long, and then she'd finally replace it. So I grew up I just took all that for granted, yeah? But ever since, I've been thinking about what went on, I guess, sociologically, but also how it is that the Democratic Party that wants to stand up for those people and always has. It's never really fundamentally betrayed them in terms of its fundamental aims. Why they've not been able to incorporate them and speak to them anymore. And the issue for me is not one of how do we lose the white working class and therefore that's one more group we have to turn to. No, what galvanized those sorts of people, going back to Roosevelt, was a vision, a picture of the kind of country the Democrats wanted to help build. And so roughly from the New Deal up until the late 70s, what I call the Roosevelt Dispensation governed the Democratic Party. It had a picture of the world it wanted to create. It was built on a couple of fundamental principles: solidarity, equal protection under the law. And it was open to anyone who was affected by inequality or a lack of solidarity. It offered a clear picture of what it represented. For all kinds of reasons, that fell apart in the 60s, everything from Vietnam to failures of the welfare state and on and on. We know that story. But that picture was very strong, so strong that even Republicans had to somehow respond to those fundamental principles. People forget that Richard Nixon proposed a quite radical program for a guaranteed minimum income in this country. He proposed national health insurance. So the Republicans had to respond and offer a program that was better at the Democrats, right? Well, then everything changed. And Reagan came along and offered another picture of a society and says, that's not who we are. Who are we? Essentially, we're individuals who are hardworking. We're in our families and in our churches. We're being held down by government. We flourish most when we're left alone. There's nothing wrong with the American people. And we're already a city on the hill, so we don't have to build any cities anymore. And if that leaves you out, good luck to you. And the Democrats themselves have had to work within that envelope. So Bill Clinton had to end welfare as we know it and focus on economic growth, as did Barack Obama. So anyway, I've gone on too long, and it's Sean's turn. But anyway, that's the frame. And then the question is, well, how did Democrats respond during the Reagan administration?
Well, I think we can circle back to Reagan, but I think one of the most important criticisms I've heard of this book, and I think it's maybe the most important, is you are correct. There was a vision of America that was predominant during this first dispensation, but there's a glaring problem with that vision, right? It's conspicuously exclusive of minorities, particularly African Americans, right? They did not benefit, or they disproportionately benefited from some of these New Deal programs, right? And what you hear from people on the cultural left, for lack of a better phrase, is that all the gains made, the reason why we have done a better job since of addressing these cultural concerns, civil rights being one, is because of the protest politics, because of the movement politics that fought for those marginalized communities and forced the rest of the country to include these people in that picture. And so as long as that picture that was being told excluded those people, perhaps there's parts of the country that was okay with that vision, right? But once that changed, their interpretation of that story did as well. And the question is, do you acknowledge that the cultural left made these important gains? And what does the left now do in order to, bring these people back into the fold?
Yeah, no. And there's truth in that. But in principle, those principles of solidarity and equal protection do not exclude anyone. In fact, they were excluded. And so the struggle was to make the country and make Democrats live up to the principles they had. That there's a democratic we, and certain people are being excluded from it. So the problem wasn't with the principles, but the delivery on the principles. And because of the Dixiecrats, because of just a sclerosis in the Democratic Party, it took social movements to really break the logjam and make things happen. So the fights for women's rights, for African Americans, not just the civil rights movement, but affirmative action and so on, gay rights. But originally, those fights were about incorporating these groups into this big democratic we. It was not about diversity. It was not about that we live in our separate tribes. It was about those groups had a claim, and they had a claim on the democratic we because something had failed. So they hadn't at first abandoned this picture of what we are as a society and what we share as citizens, and ought to share as citizens, ought to share. But then something happened. And what happened was that an ideology of difference, of a fixation on social movements as opposed to party politics, fragmented the liberal progressive left and turned its eye from the need to have an overriding vision. It is not the case that Democrats just started catering to groups. I read that all the time. They started catering to these groups. Well, they were catering to people who had been denied their rights and were not being taken care of. That's not catering. Rather, they got so focused on identity that they lost the habit of talking to people outside of these groups, finding a language that would bind them together, and offer a message so that whether it's a young woman living in young black woman in southeastern Washington, or a coal miner's daughter in West Virginia, could see a message of principle, and they would both say, yeah, that speaks to me. And they're not thinking about their other differences, and they might work together. That's the problem with what happened with movement politics and identity.
Well, Something you write in the book is that you say we need more mayors, not more marches. And
I didn't say no marches. I said we need no more marches.
Okay. Well, my question to you would be, why not both? Why this binary distinction? Why can't we manage both of these things simultaneously? Why does that choice have to be made?
It has to be made because we're not doing it. I mean, there's no a priori reason why that wouldn't be the case. But what happens is that a certain habit of mind developed on the Democratic side, and that is to think of America in terms of groups, to constantly talk about our differences as a way of trying to incorporate people, understandably. And there was a shift from movement politics focused on single issues, from party politics to the politics of single issues. And movement politics has a certain logic. You're a maximalist, you don't compromise, and your picture of politics is that there's a wall up there, and you've got to break through that wall and get recognition, right? But party politics, which is how you get actual power and actually help people, requires reaching out to people who are unlike yourself. And you've got to focus on winning elections. And that means sometimes, having to make your own issue the second issue and not the first issue, because you have a common interest in holding power. And so movements are about speaking truth to power. Party politics is about seizing power to defend the truth. And if there's one refrain that I wish I'd put on every page of the book, it's that you can't help anyone if you don't hold power. And I want the Democratic Party to focus single-mindedly on seizing power in places where it can. We have a constitutional right to abortion in this country thanks to movement politics. We have large parts of the country where a woman cannot get an abortion. No amount of marching, no new hats, none of that is going to open up clinics there and protect doctors who provide abortions. What will? You've got to go to those states where there are a lot of white evangelicals, and you've got to speak to them. And you need to win office there. If you're serious about protecting a woman's right to abortion. The same with voting rights for African Americans. If you have a totally Republican state and they can gerrymander black voters out of being able to wield their power, we achieve nothing. Having a diverse group of people on the stage of the Democratic Convention contributes zero to that. We must win state and local elections across the country. This is no longer a game. It's no longer about recognizing people, letting people talk, making sure certain things are voiced. That's over. We're in a fight for this country, and we have to crush the Republican Party. That's what I'm about.
I think something I struggle with, because I'm actually pretty sympathetic to a lot of your diagnoses, but I think a concern a lot of people have, right, is we are currently deep sunk in the middle of an administration that ran a nakedly ethno-nationalist campaign, that has an attorney general that is reigniting the drug war and attacking voting rights all over the place. And so these very marginalized communities feel under assault. And so they're asserting themselves in that context. And so how does the Democratic Party respond to those threats and protect those people without compromising their commitment or without rhetorically offending this percentage of the country that apparently is okay with this? How do they walk that line?
You got to win. You have to make sure that a person like this never becomes president again. That is job one.
But here's the problem. That's not a concrete plan, right? So we just had President Obama.
So I guess you're asking, what do we stop doing?
Well, I guess I'm asking you, what is the story that this is supposed to tell, right? Because Barack Obama, for his entire 8 years, basically painted this picture, right? That we are not the red states, we're not the blue states, we're the United States of America. We. He offered this picture of solidarity about which you speak and in which I believe. And it didn't seem to work, or it produced a backlash in the form of Donald Trump. And so what is it that he didn't do that you think he should have done? Or what is it that, because I think what happens in your book at certain points is you conflate, campus leftist politics, which are always a little deranged. Young people are deranged. I was in college. I mean, this is, that you expect 20-year-olds to, go through their Chomsky, Marx phase. But to conflate the campus politics with democratic politics as such, I think, is a bit of a mistake.
Well, campus politics is another subject in my mind that we can talk about. But look, my feeling is that when fascists descend into the streets, you descend into the streets. And that's what people did. And not only in Charlottesville, but also in Boston, that fantastic turnout in Boston. You show up, right? Now, the Antifa people are our enemies. They're going to screw everything up for us if we aren't very firm about them. But you show up. And we are seeing this ugly face. I saw it where I grew up. I mean, people were voting for George Wallace in 1972. I know the face of this. This is no surprise to me that this exists out there. And so we have to let people know that we're behind them, right? What is the next step, though? We have got to be competitive in all these areas of the country. Now, there's another issue that you touch on, and part of that is allergy. It's not Barack Obama. We focus way too much on the presidency. We have a daddy complex about the presidency, where that's not really where power is held in this country. It's held in state and local level, but also in culture. And, there's a strong diversity message that comes out everywhere in our culture right now, I would say. Newspapers, Hollywood, Star Trek movies where, every possible group has to be, taking turns on the captain's seat. And we're working on ourselves that way. We're trying to change people's hearts and minds and changing society. And it's a good thing to do. But it's not surprising that there's going to be some backlash, right? And you don't want to make it worse by exacerbating people's sense that you have contempt for them, contempt for their way of life, or they don't count. I was a big Hillary supporter, but one of the problems in her campaign is that she would go to campaign rallies and enumerate various groups. She would call out, and they were all there for her. Why not? But she conspicuously did not call out to lots of other groups, which are not the preferred groups in the elite democratic liberal mind, right? You got to remind yourself, 1 of every 4 Americans is an evangelical. 37% of the population lives in the South, in red states. Now, if you're not able to talk to them, you can't defend anybody. So you've got to think about your message. You've got to think about finding a language that doesn't pit one group against another or just lists groups, but lays out a theme that's authentic, that really comes out of you, that people might, over time, start to see themselves in.
I think another doubt I have is I wonder how responsive or how much hunger there is out there for this kind of story, right? So Nancy Pelosi can spin any yarn she wants about America's greatness. I used to live in Mississippi. Those people aren't interested in that. They're not going to respond to that. And we just had a man who won the presidency, and his entire story consists of 4 words. This was the vision. We're just going to make America great again. That sprinkled with a whole lot of nasty rhetoric about minorities and Muslims and all the rest of it, and he won. And I don't know how, I don't know what the story looks like or what it sounds like that these Democratic Congress people can go to these districts in eastern Pennsylvania or in western Georgia, and what they can say, that the message they can deliver that will resonate, because these cultural grievances, however justified, are real and they are deep. And I don't know how to get around that. I don't know what the magic sauce is. And
Yeah.
Maybe you do.
No, I don't. I don't think anyone knows what to do. All I'm trying to do is to get people focused on that and not just in shoring up our base with various groups that have already voted for us. There's a cultural allergy there. So the first thing you do is you don't make it worse. The Hippocratic Oath, right? Do no harm. And that's where the campus politics comes in, because, you know, we're just feeding things to Fox News, right, about campus craziness, campus follies. And rather than NBC being the first to report it and the first to attack it, because these are illiberal people who want to shut down conversation in the university, we leave it to Fox News to do it, right? So we've got to begin with, just stop doing all of that. But there is a ray of hope, I think, when it comes to thinking about turning towards a vision, and that is that Donald Trump destroyed Reagan's vision. He actually spoke about workers who might need protection. Well, Reagan Republicans don't recognize that. The market works, there's no problem, right? Your wages go down. You know, it's all for the greater good. You're going to be fine eventually, right? Donald Trump, in a way, struck a couple themes having to do with solidarity. Nothing about equal protection under the law, that's for sure. But with solidarity, we stand up for our workers. Now, so there's no real competitor out there in the right-left sense. There's a competitor from below, right? And I don't know how one deals with that. But there are real problems out there, real suffering, and if Democrats can address those problems in a language that doesn't put people off, and it's convincing. We actually care about these towns. It's not Trump that cares about these towns. He'll say anything. We actually care about them. And that's why we're here. That's why we show up. That's why we are going to have a 50-state strategy, even if it costs us money and energy, because we're building for a next generation. We're there. And we're going to listen to you, and we're going to hear what the problems are, and we're going to try to convince you that a democratic plan for solidarity is going to benefit you. It's not going to happen at once. People are going to roll their eyes. You know what's going to happen. But you go out there and you do it. It's evangelical work.
Now, do you think that the Democrats can avoid getting sucked into the identity politics trap when the Republicans are playing their own version of identity politics? It's just white identity politics, right? And this came up in our interview, and for those of you who didn't see that, I'll re-raise it here because I think it's important. And that is, you're correct that Ronald Reagan told a story about the shining city on the hill and America's greatness and all the rest of it. But there was a dark underbelly to his campaign as well, right? There was also a whole lot of stuff about welfare queens, right? And a lot of dog whistling. And that was also part of that story. And the people, the target audience for that heard it loud and clear, right? And so they play this game too. And if you're on the other side, it's very difficult to not get sucked into that, to not want to defend the targets of that. And so it seems like this inescapable spiral. And unfortunately, as you point out, identity politics is a numbers game. And at least for now, there are more white people in this country than there are anything else. So if we're going to get into a contest of identity politics, white people are probably going to win. And that's what is happening right now, or at least that's what's happening at the presidential level. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about how to get out of that trap.
Look, we know that there are dog whistles, but the role of dog whistles in our elections, I think, have been vastly overestimated the past couple years. And it's a convenient myth because Democrats will simply say, well, they're doing it and we're responding, and it's nothing but identity issues. Because if you think that all these white voters are only voting for identity reasons, that just confirms your sense that we ought to be doing the same thing, which is suicidal. Steve Bannon is totally right about that. Right? Keep this focus on identity. It's working for me, he says, and it is working for him. So, of course you defend these groups, but you do it in the name of principles that are not about groups. We have to set large themes that everyone can see themselves in. and tell ourselves no comforting stories. We are disliked. We are hated. We are mocked in large parts of the country. That's our problem. We can't say it's unfair. Yeah, it's unfair. As that great American philosopher Jimmy Carter said, life is unfair, right? Yeah. But it's a reality, and you have to work around it. Fox News is your reality as a liberal. And if you don't take it into account every time you're on the stump, you're shooting yourself.
Here's the problem with, speaking of Fox News, right? So even if the Democratic Party, from the president all the way down, adopted your proposal and said all the right things and just cut out all this crap about identity politics, if 6 sophomores at Oberlin College walk out of a critical theory course and set fire to a couple of trash cans and go on a march, Fox News is going to run with it, and they're going to turn it into this giant boogeyman. And in this age of post-truth, talk radio and right-wing radio in general are going to tell this story no matter what. And the people on that side of the aisle, they're going to hear it. That's all they're going to hear. And I just wonder if, no matter what the Democrats do, is there any way they can avoid that kind of characterization? And if that's the case, what really changes, even if they do say all the right
Well,
things?
we can do 2 things. One, don't feed the beast. And the other is be the first to criticize these things. Yeah? So people see, that we recognize this is nuts. Yeah? There's nothing to be lost there in pointing out what is actually the case. But one thing I think I want to add to this, because I may leave a misimpression. There's no way to understand American social problems without understanding identity. Unless you have a deep understanding of racism in this country, if you don't have a deep understanding of homophobia and how it works in human beings, you're not going to understand what's going on here at all. So we have to think and talk about identity in order to understand what to do and to figure out who we want to help. But when it comes to actually addressing those problems, you need to have political power. And the identity thing is not working. So think about identity, pay attention to it to figure out what you want to do. And then when you go out, you've got to persuade people who are unlike you. As I've been saying to college groups, you got to go to a place where the Wi-Fi sucks, where you have no desire to take a picture of your dinner, and you're sitting there with people who have their heads bowed in prayer in thanks for that dinner. You got to take a big humility pill. Co-ed and jock in college. You've got to take a big humility pill, activists. You're willing to go out and go around the world to do good works on your year off or your summer off before you go to Morgan Stanley or some other company. Right? You take a gap year, do these dramatic, romantic things. They're all good things to do, sure. Let me give you a hard one. Go to Arkansas. Go to a small town where we might have a chance to have a mayor in a medium-sized city. Go to people's picnics. Go to VFW halls. Sit in a bar and shoot the shit with people. Get to know them. Go to their homes and try to convince them that we're standing up for them. Donald Trump is not. That's a hard task. Let me see you do that. I'm talking to my students, sorry.
So I guess what we'll do, if we could have everyone, if you would like to ask a question, if you could just line up at one of those mics, I guess we'll go one at a time and try to say your question as slowly and clearly as possible, and I'll repeat it for anyone who may not hear it. And I guess maybe we'll start with you.
And please, if I can ask, because they're not leaving us much time for this, make sure it's a question.
Okay.
All
Yes.
right.
2 questions. One is, could you talk about the kind of friction between the centrist Democrats and the Bernie Sanders portion of the party? And I kind of thought Bernie Sanders had a message. I kind of thought Bernie Sanders excited a lot of people in my home state of Iowa, which is pretty much blue collar except for the city. So kind of what is that tension going on right now? Is that fighting for identity or is that fighting for a vision? And the second thing is, I guess I kind of saw it. Have you heard about the racial? The Brookings put out a book on racial diversity, and do you think though this election was about whitelash, against minorities or people of color, or the fact that by 2050, white people will be considered the minority, and persons of color will be the majority? And I kind of think that somehow those disadvantaged white people in rural communities and in economically depressed communities, whatever, somehow have to have a focus about their plight. So
Yeah,
those are the
good.
two things that I have.
Great.
Okay. And they're kind of connected, I guess. The Bernie question is that Bernie spoke about solidarity, right? Basic democratic value. And he was on message, and he talked about actual problems on the ground, and these problems are everywhere. He did not talk about identity. He did not focus on it. He didn't avoid it if the question came up at all. The problem with Bernie, to my mind, is that his economics are stuck in the 1930s, and so totally unrealistic program. But also, by focusing single-mindedly on class, we don't talk enough about, we need to talk much more about class in this country than we do about identity, is that he never struck a theme that would, never struck the theme in a way that would make people hopeful. He was kind of, the Grim Reaper, right? And Americans need that. But Bernie is kind of the model of that. Now, so you think you can reach a lot of people, but I don't know if it's the study you were referring to, but Tom Edsel just had a piece a couple days ago in the Times saying that people who think they have a white identity and that matters to them, having that view is highly correlated with voting for Donald Trump. But a correlation is not a cause. And I don't think Donald Trump would have lost if he didn't play the race card, I think, with a lot of these people, because the economic message was so significant. And it was against elites. I don't think it was racial so much as against elites. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, the country is changing. And, we need to ease people into that. And we do that through social reform and education. And we do that by reaching out to individual people.
I like that, what you said, easing this country, easing people into that, because that's happening.
Yeah, can I just, I'm just going to read very briefly, because I know there are a lot of questions, from an email I got yesterday from a guy who lives in Lancaster County, rural Pennsylvania. And his job is that he goes around to public schools and talks about race relations and gets whites and minorities to talk to each other. And he said, I appreciated your comments. I'm working, on all of these issues, but I'm a conservative, evangelical, although that's loaded these days, Republican from rural white America, although not a Trump supporter. The way you describe the liberal approach in trying to get me to vote Democratic is spot on. Ad hominem attacks and disrespect repulses me. It certainly doesn't draw me in. And then he goes on to say, I know I grew my respect for one liberal in the last week. Is that really so hard to reach people like this as Democrats? I don't think it is. That's what we got to do.
Hi, my name's Tim Noah, and you're talking about issues that I've been thinking about for decades. And I wanted to mention the word unions. I'm now the labor policy editor at Politico. And one thing that exasperates me with almost all conversation about whether the Democrats, whether liberalism, is that they now systematically exclude any discussion of unions, or if unions are no longer thought to be viable, institutions to replace them that will empower workers. You mentioned solidarity being a central issue for a theme for the Democratic Party. That was largely because unions were an extremely important constituents constituency for the Democrats. Labor has been declining in this country. A lot of people think it's since the 70s. It's really since the 50s. The percentage of union members has been in decline. And it just exasperates me that this notion that the decline of labor has just about everything to do with what you're talking about doesn't get discussed. Chuck Schumer wrote an op-ed for the New York Times a couple months ago where they were trying to steal some of Bernie's thunder. They didn't discuss any labor issues. They didn't discuss the word union didn't come up once. Do you have any thoughts on that?
What he said. I mean, I agree with you entirely, and I'm glad you added that if unions as we have them are no longer viable given the structure of work today, we have to find some way to protect workers. That's absolutely right. I mean, where I grew up, just about every neighbor belonged to the UAW, and Walter Reuther was a great hero in the family. Jimmy Hoffa not so much, but Walter Reuther, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering sort of to what extent you think that the media infatuation with the repugnance of identity politics is itself kind of the expression of an agenda. Specifically,
can you explain what you meant by that? The fascination with the repugnance, I'm sorry?
Of campus identity politics, whether this is an expression of an agenda. I'm thinking kind of claims that organizations like FIRE are themselves kind of instigating or initiating a distraction that keeps us from a conversation about economic justice more broadly, and whether, by placing so much blame on sonorous students and diversity deans, you're sort of ignoring this time-honored tradition in the United States that the left, marches on the English department and the right marches on the White House. I mean, shouldn't we sort of ignore that set of arguments altogether and just try to get at something broader?
What set of arguments? We should not be. We should stop talking about campus stuff and focus on winning the White House. Is that what you're saying?
And so I just I take your critique very.
I don't know what FIRE is, so that's why.
Well, it's an organization that showed up on a university campus and showed that awful kind of pillaring of a faculty member. But
right.
what bothers me about this is that
Sure.
Clearly there's an agenda behind an organization like that.
Sure.
That's trying to get the conversation focused on identity politics.
Sure.
So how do you escape that and start a broader conversation that not only connects to people in Macomb or these other places, but that is somewhat universalistic in the kind of New Deal consensus sense.
Yeah, things like that have Bannon's fingerprints all over them, right? And we just cannot fall into the trap. And so that's why we've got to change the subject. Sometimes one of the most important things you do in politics is not win an argument; it's to change the subject.
I mean this very respectfully, Professor Lilla, but are you falling into the trap?
I don't know how.
I mean, just by placing so much blame on the sonorous students and the diversity deans?
Well, no, because Fox News is focusing on them, right? And I'm trying to redirect their energy and trying to convince them, because universities produce political elites. It's not just the theatrics that I'm bothered by. It's that what they learn in the university is movement politics is really what changes history. And they learn nothing about party politics. And while that was true for part of our history, from the 50s through the 70s, that social movements accomplished a lot, that's not been true since Reagan. The real game has been that. And so I want to refocus on that. But thank you.
Hasn't the identity that the Democratic Party most aligned itself with, the identity group, is the middle class? If you look about most of the rhetoric during the last several campaigns has about the middle class this, more so even than the blacks, the gays, the women, Hispanics, whatever. It's such a focus on the middle class. The Democrats used to be the party of the working class. And I have relatives in West Virginia who voted for Trump. My aunt told me she doesn't know anybody personally in her group that makes $20 an hour. That would be $40,000 a year. That would be barely middle class. I think the largest identity group and what is most problematic to a lot of these people is that the working class has been left out. And the focus for people, what's the middle class start? People make over $60,000, $80,000 a year. How many people are left out of that?
Yeah. No, I understand. I wouldn't call them identity groups. That's the only thing that I would differ. But no, because what is so difficult about identity politics is that people imagine they have this little homunculus within, which is their identity, right? And so identity is intimate in a way that belonging to one class rather than another is not so intimate, and that's why it's hard. That's why it can be so divisive and why it's so hard to talk about.
So I guess I'm with the lady in the red shirt and the gentleman in the blue shirt. How can you say that the economic progressive argument worked for Trump and that Bernie's economics was the economics of the 1930s? In fact, they're the same thing. Bernie's there's something wrong with our economics when all the results of economic growth go to the top 1%. And he talked about labor unions. There are a lot of ways of making that the way it used to be. Not the jobs that used to be, but the wages that used to be. The manufacturing jobs aren't good jobs because they're manufacturing. They were good jobs because they were union jobs.
That's right.
And we can do that now via government. And I think that's what Bernie was saying. The central theme should be millionaires and billionaires and the Koch brothers.
Right. And instead people voted for Trump because Americans engage in magical thinking, right? And so Trump says, we're going to redo these trade deals. There's going to be no problem. We'll build the wall. Everything's going to happen on its own, and no one's going to have to sacrifice, right? It's just going to happen, yeah? But Bernie, was honest enough to say we're going to have to go after these people and their interests, and also, they're very powerful in campaign financing. He listed all this stuff, and because he was more honest about the real problem, it didn't satisfy this need for, instant solutions that Americans have.
I feel, just really quickly, I think it's a point that has to be made, that underneath all these arguments we're having is the fact that Donald Trump was a lot of things. But above all, he was political dynamite, and he sold himself as dynamite, as someone who was just going to blow things up. And that message worked in part because people have lost faith in the government as an institution. They no longer believe in it, and that is because it has failed them. It's failed all of us, right? And so I think part of the reason why people are drawn into this is because they feel that failure. They feel it in their lives, and I think that makes it more difficult to sell a message to them about that requires them to believe it. I'm not saying it's not possible, but that issue is looming in the background, and I think it makes delivering this message very complicated.
Yeah, it's a game that Republicans have been able to play because they don't respond to social problems. And when people say we've got these social problems, they say it's because of the government, right? When it's the lack of strong government and focus and all the rest. And somehow we've not been able to crack that nut, to give people confidence. And, to build confidence, we have to first hold office. And then we have to be, practical about what we actually can do, but it's not easy.
Thank you. I would agree with you that without political power, there's little that we can change in terms of really getting things done. But I do want to caution you about moving and not thinking in terms of when you say no more marches. I don't agree with that at all. Okay, because that is a form of empowerment for people. I don't agree with that. And this lady, I think, was on point, as well as the lady from West Virginia. As a woman of color who is a descendant of people who were enslaved, and you will understand this from Mississippi, if you lived in Mississippi, I want you to understand that the problem with Barack Obama is that he was a black man, okay? And we need to not deny that. We need to recognize it for what it is. When you saw the neo-Nazis and the other folks in Charlottesville, they said to you, and it was just what Trump had said, make America white again. Now, those of us who are in the African-American community and people of color had no misgivings about understanding the code language, and that is what it was. You can go to any community fair in rural South Carolina and Appalachia, other places, and when he was running and they thought he might end up in a photograph or a picture with other presidents, You could just hear them. All you had to do was listen and be in these places. And that part of it, I agree with you. And there are schools like Howard University right here in the District of Columbia that spend every spring break going to Appalachia, going to the Ninth Ward in New Orleans and Louisiana and other places like this. They don't go to the beaches and stuff anymore and have fun spring breaks. And schools all over the country, you know, are doing that. They're doing it at the University of Delaware, where I have a nephew. So I want to caution you against that, and I hope the people here will not give up on marching as a form of empowerment, because it does speak, but we can certainly move beyond that. But make no mistake about it, the fact that the First Lady was African American, and she talks about that sometime and how she was received during his entire presidency, and it is what it is. And yes, the statues need to come down. If I had been in South Carolina, I would have been helping that young lady pull down that Confederate flag. And I don't want any of you to move away from that. Yes, let's do more, reach out, but recognize the history of this country, and that some people, as the young speaker said the other day, were stamped from the beginning. That is the history of our United States of America, and it colors everything, everything. Racism is real, it is painful, it is destructive, as are all the other isms. And we need to continue to fight that fight, but be powerful politically as well.
Thank you, Matt. Let me see if I can turn that into a question.
No, well, that's fine. I mean, no, it seems like a question to me. And again, I'll have to say what she said. Certainly, with Obama, it was very clear. But it was interesting because it was not just that he was black; it was that he was he was educated, and he seemed to represent a class, right? Had it been a sports star, I don't know what would have happened. But there's no denying that. And you put your finger on something I haven't mentioned, I'm glad you did, and that is that when I say we need no more marches, that means we don't need any. I mean, we don't need more right now. What we need is people focused on winning elections. But movement politics and marches do something very important, which you put very well. And that is that they give people a sense of empowerment, right? So as a way of mobilizing energy to making people feel they're not alone, that they're a force out there, these sort of rituals, if you want to call them that, are crucial. However, once you become that force, you've got to focus on becoming part of a party that will seize power to defend you. Mm-hmm. That's the next part, which I think you agree with.
Yes, I
if what I took you. But as for the rest of it, you're totally right about that.
And I am comfortable in the evangelical church. I am just as comfortable in the synagogue and temple and all the others. And I agree, more people need to go there and hear and listen and be a part of. It doesn't have to become you, but you do get a better understanding.
Thank you.
So I think we're running a little short of time. Don't worry, I'm not going to cut you off yet. But I would just ask that for the people who are remaining in line, get to your question as quickly as possible and make it as concise as possible. Thank you.
My question is, do you find a problem with, is this working? Okay. The issue of kind of a fear in the left intelligentsia of any type of particularism rooted in a nation or civilization. So some of Sean's colleagues at Vox are writing articles basically for open borders. Yeah. Dylan Matthews, this is not fake news, people. Yeah. People saying that basically any immigration restrictionism is racist. People saying that the word Western civilization, not just the way Trump is using it, but the phrase itself is racist or problematic. So I guess my question is, do you fear kind of that parts of the American left are moving almost in a French direction of the French left towards kind of a sort of extreme cultural masochism, if you will?
There are many ways to commit suicide. Yeah. And so this is also one. Mm-hmm. People want to feel proud of their country. America is different from other countries in many ways, but one is that we think of this country as a project. And we're just a country like other countries, but we think of it as a project, right? There is no Belgian project. You're just Belgian. But Americans get galvanized when they have a sense that we're a nation trying to accomplish something together. And to do that, you have to be a nation. Now, and that means that there's an inside and an outside. It doesn't mean that you treat people on the outside badly at all, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly, right now, it's crucial for us to have a sane and clear immigration policy as liberals and Democrats. And that is that it is fundamental to any democracy that when people vote for a law about who can get in and who can't, that law is enforced, period. We are the party of law. They're the party of lawlessness, right? So no sanctuary cities in my view. Now there are now we have to protect some people right now. It's a difficult moment because, a lot of people are sort of being hunted right now. But I would like to have a very liberal immigration policy. I would like us to be offering language lessons, but that the law would be enforced. And it just we're just feeding this fantasy, I think, among the white working class that liberals care about everybody but me. They care more about foreigners than they do about us. They're always crying about immigrants, and they never come out and see us and what we're going through, right? So yeah, but this comes with but there's another side to that which the right won't articulate, and I will, and that is that we're a nation, and that means that we control our borders, but we're also a nation. We're not just a free market.
Yes, absolutely.
We are not a campsite where we just pull our RVs in and plug into the power and the water and then go out. We're a country, and that means you owe something to your fellow citizens, right? We're going to tax you, and you deserve to be taxed because we're in this together, right? And so these two things, and so to have a more sense, a greater sense of not only national being, but national duty, I think could really help us.
Thank you.
Okay, look, what I think I would ask you all to do is, I'm not sure how many people we have in line right now. But
two more there.
Okay, I would just, two more here and two more there. If you could just ask your question very quickly and then
I'll
do
answer
it,
quickly.
But we're going to have maybe 3 or 4 people ask their questions quickly, and then you can just respond to them all in one sort of kind of grand concluding statement.
Okay.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on what's going to happen in 2018? My read is the Democrats aren't ready for it. They've got, $40 million. The party has $40 million. The Republicans have $85 million. We've heard from the introduction that it's disarray and they aren't very well organized. And the stuff you're saying, I agree with everything you say. So what are the prospects in 2018?
It just seems to me that both the Democrats and the Republicans are the party of nostalgia, in that we look back to FBR and the unions, and the Republicans look back to Reagan era. Well, I think, at least for me, the fundamental reason why Trump got elected is that we're operating on obsolete software. We have 1970 solutions to 2020 problem. And your reaction to that?
Okay, this will be the last one.
Hi there, my name is Osita Wanevu. I write for Slate. My question is this. To what extent do you think the changes the Democratic Party needs to make are substantive? And to what extent do you think that they are rhetorical? Meaning, do you think that there actually needs to be a substantive shift in the identity political orientation of the Democratic Party? Or do you just think that the Democratic Party needs to frame their priorities in a more universal way?
Okay, so and that's an excellent question. So our two final questions basically are, what are the Democrats' prospects in 2018, and are the changes they need to make rhetorical or substantive? Because I think the idea that this is a problem for which there is purely a rhetorical solution is deeply misguided. But I will leave the floor to you, and this will be our final comment.
I have no idea what's going to happen in the elections. I never predict any of this, and none of us do. And in answer to the second question, let me read you what the epigraph in the book is, and it's from Senator Ted Kennedy. He said in a speech once, "We must understand that there is a difference between being a party that cares about labor and being a labor party. There's a difference between being a party that cares about women and being a women's party. And we can and must be a party that cares about minorities without being a minority party. We are citizens first. That should be our message again. Now, what goes along with that is that we are a party that cares about women and minorities and labor. And so substantively, we have thoughts about that, and they need to be 21st century thoughts and not nostalgic thoughts. You're right about that. But rhetoric really matters right now because we need to frame what we're doing. No one knows what we stand for, right? We don't give a clear picture of that, and that would be a start in my view.
Well, I think this is a conversation that could go on and on for hours, but let's give Mark a round of applause.